Hey, it's a busy holiday week, and during this week, we are bringing you a look back at some of the most compelling stories and conversations we've covered for you in 2024. It's 24 in review.
This is the examination of the hidden human condition.
You're listening to the Hidden Killers Podcast.
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast with Tony Brueski.
We are talking with forensic scientist and professor Dan Crane today. Let's talk about the idea of just what we get on us when we're in a room, when we're in a setting. Dust everywhere. There's plenty on me, I'm sure, that are from objects in this room, from my dogs that have been in this room, and everything that emits something. Could this be used in some way, shape, or form in very specific cases? I mean, it's one thing if the person of interest or you're looking for, has been out of the crime scene for months and months. Probably fairly difficult to say that you were in that room based on any sort of DNA. But what about those cases where someone is immediately caught, immediately arrested after some sort of suspect incident? Could this lead to something where one could go in terms of how they investigate and, okay, you're accused of being at this crime scene. Could a sample of that room, and I guess how unique is each room's signature, if you will? And could that then be looked at? Could a sample be gathered from an individual in some way, shape, or form that matches and says, well, what we found on you is also the same residue, the same imprint that we have over here from this very specific room? I guess it really would very much depend on how unique those fingerprints are of the room and the individual and how well they can be matched up. Is that a thing? Could it be a thing someday?
So 3 thoughts come to mind.
Okay.
And you mentioned the word unique a couple of times just in the last 30 seconds or so. How unique are those fingerprints or those signatures? And that's one of the big questions, is how impressed should you be? How impressed could you be that you found a particular combination of DNA markers, or maybe even just a particular combination of species, right? You mentioned you have a dog in the room, right? Maybe, the breed is something you could talk about. Hey, we found a beagle's DNA here, right?
And there was a beagle at the crime scene. Something like where just the composition of everything, I would think, makes up its own unique signature from the room I'm in right now, the room you're in right now, to your kitchen, to your basement, your living room.
Well, and again, that these are questions that have not been answered and need to be answered, and I'm afraid it would be very difficult to answer them. There's a reasonable question as to how independent things might be, right? Having a beagle might make it much more likely that you would also, find something that you wouldn't imagine was associated with beagles was also present, like carrots. You may find carrot DNA more often in rooms or households where there are beagles, just because, there's some sort of coincidence that we didn't appreciate before. Yeah. And so unique is an open question. It's a very difficult question to answer. And that's just the thoughts that comes to mind. Another is, again, concerns about the transferability and the persistence of DNA. When you're talking about trace amounts of DNA, dust, you could pick it up and carry it around, or somebody else could pick it up and carry it around, or the wind could literally pick it up and carry it around. So how the DNA got there, how long it has been there, are going to be important questions that ultimately are going to make this really hard to put any sort of statistical weight on. And that kind of brings me then to the third thought that comes to mind. And that is that, I think you understand that law enforcement can say pretty much anything that they like during an interrogation. And so in the end, I think that might be the most effective use of this kind of testing, is for a detective to say to somebody in an interrogation room, it's like, look, we've done eDNA testing on you and on the crime scene, and we've found you're a perfect match for all sorts of things. We looked to see what sort of dogs were present, what kind of vegetables were present, what sort of pollen was present. And at every point, you match. Whether they can put a number on it or not, whether it's even true or not, a detective could use that perhaps to cajole or encourage somebody to be more forthcoming than they might have been otherwise. And so in that setting, you don't need the science. You don't need the statistics. And that in the end may be the best practical application of this kind of testing. How law enforcement generates investigative leads is one thing. How it is that evidence gets presented in court is another.
Yeah.
And if law enforcement wants to use this kind of testing for the purposes of generating investigative leads, more power to them. And there's no reason that they shouldn't. If they want to use it to secure a conviction by presenting it as evidence in a courtroom, they really should be holding off until they can, at the same time, say how impressed somebody should be that this individual was associated with that crime scene or the crime scene was associated with the individual.
How interesting. I mean, I can imagine so many issues coming up with that when we get to like appellate issues and things and the way it's presented. But nonetheless, it would be a very compelling argument to give someone in an interrogation room to see if maybe you can elicit more information out of them. So fascinating to watch where this is going. Let's talk about some other areas of DNA technology. We're always hearing about there's touch DNA, there's this type of DNA. What are other areas that you see coming into light and to be used in terms of connecting people to their crimes that maybe we're not there yet, but the technology is, it's on the burner. It's working. It's being tested. It's going through its steps.
Well, DNA testing was really first used in criminal cases in the U.S. in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And the particular markers, the particular markers that started to be used for those purposes are ones that we're pretty much still using today. The kind of genetic markers are still the ones that are being used today. They're based on polymorphisms, differences in the lengths of certain regions of DNA that are known to be likely to differ from one person relative to another. That's not the way that these systems would have been designed if we were developing those tests today.
Okay.
The markers that would have been used wouldn't have been length differences. They would have been sequence differences. They would have been looking at specific individual nucleotides that are different. The technical term would be single nucleotide polymorphisms, often just referred to as SNPs. Tests, if they were being designed today, would be built around SNPs rather than length differences. And those SNPs would lend themselves to things like what's called next generation sequencing, where you could actually sequence the entirety of an individual's genome as part of a criminal investigation. And you could sequence an evidence sample, the genome of that individual, the entire 3.2 billion nucleotides that spell out their genetic instructions. And so that would be useful not just for the purposes of human identification, it would also be helpful for profiling purposes. You could say, hey, this is a Caucasian, or hey, this is a Caucasian with blonde hair, unless they've altered it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things like that. And the reason that you don't just switch, we know this has been available for at least the last 10 years. The reason that you don't just switch over to this new, better testing basis is it's essentially momentum. The FBI has a convicted offender database that has approaching 15 million convicted offenders' DNA profiles in it. All of those have been generated using that original technology. Mm-hmm. None of them have been done with this emerging or this newer technology. And it's not trivial to go back and retest 15 billion samples. In fact, it may not even be possible. Many of them have probably been destroyed, and many of the sources are probably deceased. So you may wonder, why do you even need to keep them? But anyway, it'll be some time, but that's not stopping some companies from offering to do that kind of testing as well, as a supplement to those first generation types of DNA tests.
Does it essentially then give you, those first generation tests pretty accurate, I would say, right? The ones that have been using and that are on file?
The ones that we're using today, still those first generation tests, are pretty much pegging the needle in terms of their sensitivity. Mm-hmm. Single nucleotide polymorphisms wouldn't be any more sensitive. So, they're pegging the needle in terms of the three criteria by which you judge a DNA test: sensitivity, discriminating power, and the speed with which you could generate a result. Mm-hmm. Right. So the current tests are fast, they're sensitive, and they allow you to distinguish pretty well between individuals. What the SNPs would do, they would also be able to deliver on all three of those criteria, but they would bring a fourth to bear, and that is that you could start then to talk about the physical appearance of the source of the DNA as well.
Want to listen ad-free? Want advanced access to all of our interviews before anyone else?
Become a True Crime Today Premium Plus subscriber on Apple Podcasts.
You get every episode commercial-free,
so you can binge on true crime
until you can binge no more.
Search True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts now, or go to our podcast page and sign up now.
More of the Hidden Killers podcast next.